Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a very slow, very fluttery stroll through a surprisingly structured little corner of Enlightenment France. No revolutions, no duels, no powdered wigs slipping off in a scandalous ballroom scandal, just butterflies, and the people, mostly very calm, very wealthy people who raised them, admired them, and occasionally sent them by post with handwritten notes and a pressed daisy tucked inside. You probably won't survive this, not because it's dangerous, but because your nervous system may shut down entirely from the sheer quiet politeness of it all. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Post your location and local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing just outside a modest chateau in the French countryside. It's the early 1700s, and nothing is in a hurry. The trees are more decorative than functional. The gravel has been raked into gentle waves, and somewhere nearby, a servant is carefully dusting the petals of a rose bush, not because anyone asked, but because it seemed like the right thing to do. This is a time when butterfly collecting is beginning to move beyond idle, aristocratic hobby into something slightly more organized. Not scientific, not yet, but definitely systematized. Wealthy landowners have started building small greenhouses and netted gardens, not for vegetables, not for profit, but purely to house insects, specifically the pretty ones. Butterflies had long been admired, of course. Medieval bestiaries featured them as symbols of the soul. Renaissance artists painted them hovering over baskets of fruit. But in the 18th century, they become something you raise, something you curate. Not quite pets, not quite trophies, something in between. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The Enlightenment era saw a dramatic increase in natural observation across Europe. In France, this took many forms: ornithology, botany, and, yes, entomology, butterfly farming, while never widespread in the commercial sense, became a fashionable pursuit among the landed classes. It was seen as both intellectually enriching and pleasantly decorative. Many of these butterfly hobbyists were educated amateurs, inspired by the writings of naturalists like Réaumur, whose six-volume memoir Pour servir à l'histoire des insectes included detailed studies on insect metamorphosis, caterpillars, pupae, and yes, butterflies. The emphasis was on close observation, life cycles, patterns, behavior, and crucially, no one was expected to rush. There's a curious fringe detail that turns up in a few estate records from this time: butterfly enclosures, delicate netted structures resembling modern greenhouses, were often placed directly next to outdoor tea areas. The idea, apparently, was that you could sip while observing your Lepidoptera guests rise and land, like airborne punctuation for your afternoon thoughts. These weren't zoos, they were salons with wings. You wander now through one of these butterfly gardens. There's a gravel path shaped like a soft S, leading past carefully cultivated patches of milkweed and violets. The butterflies aren't confined, exactly, but they're encouraged to linger. Sugar water bowls rest on sun-warmed stones. Sticks are arranged into tiny archways, as though the insects might prefer an architectural experience. And inside the chateau, The butterfly room, always near the back, light drenched, quiet, cabinets with glass tops and drawers of pinned specimens, none of it morbid, just arranged, lovingly, meticulously arranged. Tiny handwritten tags identify the species in Latin and French. Some have notes in the margins found near the apricot trees. Wings unusually gold in early June. The handwriting is careful, deliberate, a kind of reverent script, usually reserved for prayer or recipe cards. Here's your first scholarly uncertainty why butterflies, and why now some believe the rise of butterfly farming in 18th century France was driven by the same impulses that led to the popularity of cabinet collections: curiosity, classification, and an urge to domesticate beauty. Others argue that butterflies provided a uniquely soft form of control, unlike fox hunts or formal gardens. Butterfly farming offered quiet satisfaction without triumph. You couldn't train a butterfly. You could only create the conditions where it might appear, and that suited the moment. Enlightenment thinkers were fascinated by order, but they were equally fascinated by wonder. A butterfly's life cycle, mysterious and visible, was both. Journey-wise, you wander now to a windowsill where a small porcelain dish holds two chrysalises, suspended by silk thread. A child curled on a footstool nearby leans in and whispers to them, not because she expects them to respond, but because whispering seems appropriate. One of them twitches slightly, and she doesn't scream, she nods, satisfied, as though she's just received a letter in a language only she speaks. Butterfly farming in 18th century France was never practical. It didn't lead to agricultural advances. It didn't feed anyone, but it fed attention. It gave people, especially those who had the time, a reason to look more closely. And in that closeness, something gentle took root. The chateau is quiet now. The butterflies settle under leaves. The nets sway slightly, catching moonlight. A page turns in a notebook, and the sound it makes is almost winged. The morning here arrives softly. No urgent light, no clanging bells, just a gentle spill of gold over linen drapes and the faint rustle of ivy outside the window. You drift downstairs into the study of the same countryside chateau, where butterfly farming has quietly taken root, not just in the garden, but in the household routine itself. The windows are wide open, letting in a breeze that smells faintly of lemon balm and paper. On a long walnut desk, beneath the watchful gaze of a sleeping cat, sits a collection of notebooks. They are thin, hand-bound, and neatly labeled vols, Isar Vuis, Etude sur les papillons. The handwriting is small and regular, the ink slightly faded, as though the writer never once pressed too hard. You flip through one, and it becomes instantly clear. This is not just a hobby, it's an archive. Every page contains dated observations: temperature, humidity, time of emergence, whether a particular butterfly landed on parsley or peppermint. There are little ink drawings, sometimes just the outline of a wing, sometimes more detailed, veins, margins, spots noted with tiny arrows and quiet awe. Here's your mainstream historical fact by the mid-1700s. Many amateur butterfly enthusiasts in France had begun to keep detailed field notes, mirroring the practices of professional naturalists, inspired by the emerging field of systematics and by thinkers like Carl Linnaeus across the border. French collectors sought to categorize not only species, but also behavior. The result was a slow and quiet boom in observational journals, most of which never left the libraries in which they were kept, and yet they weren't useless. These notebooks often became community knowledge, shared between friends, copied by hand, and sometimes even cited anonymously. Of course, in more official publications, the boundary between scientist and enthusiast was thin, and everyone, it seemed, was willing to trade a little insight for the price of a pot of jam and a sunny seat by the garden wall. There's a particularly charming fringe detail from a salon in Bordeaux, one well-known collector, a retired magistrate with too much time and far too many inkwells, was said to record the temperament of each butterfly, not scientifically, just based on how they landed. If a butterfly flitted too much, he'd mark it as restless. If it lingered on the same bloom for more than 10 seconds, it was meditative. And if it bumped into another butterfly and kept going, it was rude. This practice, while scientifically dubious, did lead to a rather poetic column in one of the smaller regional papers titled The Personalities of Lepidoptera. It ran for 6 issues before quietly being replaced by potato yields. Your surroundings now include a series of pale wooden drawers pulled open and left ajar for ventilation. Inside, rows of empty chrysalises, some saved, some recorded with tiny labels. The attention to detail is overwhelming, but never frantic. Everything feels unhurried, the kind of careful that only happens when there are no deadlines and no one is watching. Here's the scholarly uncertainty that threads through this era. Were these collectors simply participating in Enlightenment curiosity? Or were they subtly resisting it, while the dominant intellectual movement of the time leaned toward rationality and categorization? Butterfly keepers often seemed drawn not to answers, but to observation itself. Many refused to speculate beyond what they could write down. They didn't theorize metamorphosis, they just watched it happen, over and over, as if repetition itself might be revelation. There's no journey in this section, really, just a slow shuffle through pages. Some are smudged from garden dirt. Some bear tiny holes where a curious caterpillar got too close. Some are pristine, with sketches so delicate they look like they were drawn with a single eyelash dipped in ink. You read notes like July thirst of 2 emerged. One yellowed, fed on time but showed no preference. Wind from northeast, seemed drowsy, and August 9th fluttered at mirror. Confused, recognized self. These notes were rarely meant for publication. They were meant for memory, for returning to, for confirming that yes, something fragile happened here, and I was lucky enough to see it. In a later notebook, an entire page is given over to a single wing pattern, copied again and again, each version slightly different. Not because the butterfly changed, because the observer wasn't sure which version matched best. That kind of uncertainty wasn't feared, it was honored, held gently, like the creature itself. The day moves on outside. The butterflies are emerging one by one from their chrysalises, stretching, wobbling, testing the sun. Inside, someone writes one more line, then closes the book with care, not because it's finished, just because it's time for tea. The afternoon light has shifted now, thicker, honeyed, curling into the corners of the garden like a cat settling down for its second nap. You step outside, onto a carefully packed gravel path bordered with yarrow and marjoram. This is no wild meadow. This is a constructed habitat, designed with as much intention as any drawing room, only here. The guests have wings. Welcome to the butterfly garden, not just a patch of flowers, but a living canvas of orchestrated color and slow movement. In 18th century France, it became fashionable for country estates to set aside part of their land not for vegetables or roses, but for butterflies. These weren't random flower beds, they were stage sets for insects, part theater, part laboratory, part tranquil escape from absolutely everything. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Many Enlightenment-era French estates featured formal gardens, but a growing number of amateur naturalists began to install butterfly-specific environments. Inspired by both scientific curiosity and a romantic vision of nature, they arranged specific nectar plants and larval host plants in tight patterns, encouraging seasonal visitation from local butterfly species. These gardens were sometimes referred to, half jokingly, as parcs ailés, or winged parks. The design principles were delightfully simple symmetry for the humans, asymmetry for the butterflies. A central path might be flanked by rows of lavender and thyme, while off to the side, wilder corners allowed milkweed and nettles to flourish, essential for egg laying. Netting might drape lightly over a section, not to trap, but to slow escape. These were not enclosures, they were invitations. You follow one such path now, gravel crunching softly beneath your feet. The air is thick with the dry sweetness of fennel and the peppery tingle of basil in bloom. Butterflies dart through shafts of sunlight, vanish, reappear. Some float lazily, some jitter like they've forgotten what flying is for. None of them notice you. Here's your fringe detail for this section. Some gardens included miniature pavilions for butterflies, small structures painted white, lined with muslin, and filled with dishes of honeyed water and rotting fruit. These refreshment stations were as much about observing feeding behavior as they were about offering comfort. One journal from 1749 notes that les papillons, when warmed by wine-soaked peach skins, danced more freely. Make of that what you will. Many butterfly gardens were tended not by the landowners themselves, but by gardeners given explicit instructions: no harsh pruning, no loud movements, and under no circumstances should they remove a leaf with an egg on it. One gardener in the Loire Valley was famously dismissed for scaring off a swallowtail by sneezing too close to the lemon balm. The butterflies were guests, the humans, attendants. The scholarly uncertainty that often arises in this context is whether these butterfly gardens were seen as scientific spaces or sentimental ones. Some argue they were proto-ecological zones, a precursor to modern pollinator gardens. Others suggest they were aesthetic experiments, controlled wildness, curated serenity. Perhaps they were both. Enlightenment France often blurred the line between intellect and indulgence. And then there's the journey element. You pause at a low bench beneath a trellis of climbing jasmine, just ahead. A red admiral lands on a flat stone and opens its wings with a kind of theatrical indifference. Behind you, someone in the manor hums a tune while snipping lavender. The pace of everything here is not slow by necessity, it's slow by design. A small sign near a patch of rue reads Zone de repos, pour les ailes comme pour les yeux, a resting place for wings and for the eyes. It's not a joke, It's a philosophy. Even the garden's layout reflects a kind of observational rhythm. Plants are grouped not just by color, but by bloom time. This way, butterflies will always have something to return to. Continuity matters. The cycle is everything. You spot a small child crouched near the base of a stone planter, holding a glass vial. Inside, a green caterpillar rests on a sprig of dill. The child says nothing, just watches. The gardener nods in approval and steps back, learning. Here is not about being told. It's about being allowed to look for a very long time. In one estate's guest book, a visitor wrote, "The butterflies seem unaware of our presence, or perhaps they tolerate us out of pity." A line meant as humor, but it captures the atmosphere perfectly. This was not a garden to control. It was a space to yield to, not to catch butterflies, but to create a place where they might choose to linger. The sun shifts again, a little lower, shadows stretch, the butterflies slow, and you, seated on a stone bench beside a clump of fennel, begin to understand the appeal. This wasn't a scientific breakthrough. This was an act of accommodation, a kind of architectural politeness, shaped entirely around fragile visitors, and as you rest, one of them lands, not on your arm, but near it, close enough to remind you that this entire section has taken place in the company of something weightless, and perfectly enough. The shadows have begun to stretch across the floorboards, long and thin, like ribbons laid out to dry. You're back indoors now, stepping carefully across polished wooden planks toward a quiet corner of the manor where curtains are drawn not to block the light, but to soften it. This isn't the drawing room in the traditional sense. No portraits, no stiff furniture, just a long table, two stools, and several trays lined with sprigs of parsley and fennel. This is where the larvae live. Yes, that's right. Caterpillars, fat, drowsy, curious caterpillars, are being raised indoors, and with more care than some of the children in the household. Butterfly farming in 18th century France wasn't just about chasing wings, it was about raising them, slowly, silently, one wriggle at a time. Here's your mainstream historical fact. As the study of insects grew in popularity among the French upper classes, many enthusiasts began raising larvae indoors to observe the complete metamorphosis process firsthand. What began as a curiosity soon became a fashion. Caterpillars were kept in shallow trays or glass cloches, fed daily, and often given nicknames. It wasn't science as we know it, but it was meticulous, and in its own way, deeply gentle. Some homes converted side rooms into insectariums. Others used corners of the salon, tucked beneath windows for warmth. The equipment was simple fresh leaves, soft brushes, gauze, little slips of paper labeled in fine ink. Children were often invited to help, but only the quiet ones. Any child who poked a larva or shrieked in excitement was removed and redirected toward marbles or embroidery. Now for your fringe detail in one documented case. A noblewoman in Normandy commissioned custom embroidered sleeves with little net pouches sewn into them, one on each wrist, so she could carry two chrysalises with her while she visited friends. The sleeves were lavender silk. The caterpillars were painted lady butterflies. She claimed it helped her meditate. Her letters suggest no one found this especially odd. And perhaps that's what's most striking here, how normal it all became. People raised butterflies the way others raised finches. Not to show off, not to profit, but because the presence of transformation, however slow, made the room feel alive. You kneel beside a low table now, where several caterpillars inch along stems of rue. One pauses, one munches, one appears to be in a state of indecision about whether to shed its skin today or tomorrow. You don't touch them. You wouldn't dream of it instead. You glance at a small ledger nearby. The notes are brief, clinical, but affectionate. 4th of July, slowed movement, skin slightly translucent, pupation, likely soon, responds to warmth. 6th of July, chrysalis formed, pale green with faint gold markings. Name Corinne. There's something deeply human about these records, not because they reveal any grand scientific breakthrough, but because they don't try to. The person writing them didn't need discovery, just continuity, the sense of having witnessed something quiet and astonishing, even if it happened slowly enough to feel like nothing at all. And here comes your scholarly uncertainty, where these butterfly rearing practices, intended as early experiments or as private rituals the journals rarely specify. There are no formal methodologies, no control groups, but they repeat the process year after year. One possible interpretation is that the observers believed consistency would eventually yield insight. Another, they simply found the routine soothing. Certainly, the influence of naturalists like Réaumur lent a veneer of legitimacy to the whole endeavor. His careful illustrations of caterpillar development were widely copied and adapted, but while he published diagrams and dissections, the average butterfly keeper was more likely to write. Chrysalis remains still, except when nudged by sunlight, journey-wise. Your role here is that of observer. You move from table to table, each tray containing a different stage of development. Some caterpillars still stretch along twigs. Others have curled into soft commas, ready to split their skin and rearrange their entire biology in peace. The air smells faintly of damp herbs and honey water. You feel like you should whisper, even though no one else is here. And then you spot a chrysalis, just one, hanging from the curve of a bedtime stem, pale green, almost translucent, with a line of dots that shimmer faintly gold in the light. A small card sits beneath it, 17th of July, first motion noted, no intervention. You watch. Nothing happens. Or rather, everything is happening. You just can't see it yet. This wasn't farming in the traditional sense. No harvest, no product. But in a world driven by salons and spectacles, raising a butterfly indoors offered something rare progress without pressure, and when the transformation is complete, they don't pin it, they open the window. You're still in the house, but you've moved to a room just off the main corridor, smaller than the salon, quieter than the drawing room. The windows here are tall and slightly open, letting in a hush of breeze that stirs the lace curtains. On the desk before you lies a folded sheet of cream-colored vellum, pinned open with a glass weight in the shape of a snail, ink pots, a magnifying lens, a sheet of fine paper, already half filled with sketches. This is where the language of wings begins, to the butterfly farmer of 18th century France. Beauty wasn't something to be admired casually. It was something to be studied, not worshipped, but translated into pattern, proportion, symmetry. The wings of a butterfly weren't just decoration, they were data. Here's your mainstream historical anchor, the Enlightenment brought with it a surge of interest in classification and structure, especially in the natural world, for French butterfly keepers. This translated into early efforts at what we now call taxonomy, long before genetics and field guides. These amateurs were recording what they could see: wing shape, color variation, number of spots, behavior during flight. They used what tools they had: quill, ink, and patient repetition. In one preserved notebook, a woman from Dijon labeled each drawing not with the species name, which she did not know, but with short, poetic identifiers: moonfire edge, twin ember dot, one who paused in rain. She wasn't incorrect. She was simply using a different system: observation before classification. Here's the fringe detail that shows up in a few of these journals. Butterfly wings were often described not just in color terms, but in the vocabulary of fabric. One entry notes a wing as black as watered silk with a hem of gold lace. Another, the green of bottle glass with a velvet undertone. It wasn't science, it was translation. The kind of language you use when you're trying to describe something beautiful to someone who isn't there. You examine one of the sketches on the table now. It's not perfect. The symmetry is a little off. One antenna curls farther than the other. But the detail in the wings is astonishing. Minute veins, tiny speckles, shaded sections marked slightly iridescent in sun. A note at the bottom read specimen sat still for 13 minutes. No twitching. Seemed unaware of observer. May return tomorrow. That's the thing with butterfly farming in this period. It didn't result in discoveries. It resulted in descriptions. And that, too, was valuable, especially in a time when even the most elaborate science still began with seeing. Scholars still debate the purpose of these butterfly illustrations. Were they purely educational, decorative, spiritual? One theory suggests that they were used as meditative tools, drawn slowly over hours, like prayer wheels in ink. Another suggests they were shared in social salons to demonstrate one's patience and refinement. Still another points out that many drawings show the same butterfly, over and over, from slightly different angles, as though the artist were trying to understand it through repetition. This brings us to your scholarly uncertainty. Was there ever a unified classification system among these amateur naturalists? The short answer: no. Each collector, each sketcher, each quiet enthusiast used their own notes, their own labels. One person's gold strip fader was another's lucide bordée. It wasn't chaos, it was personal. The idea wasn't to solve the butterfly, it was to know it. Your journey style detail here is gentle. You sit at the desk, you pick up the magnifying glass, you lean in close to examine a dried wing under the lens, not as a scientist, but as a guest. You notice that the blue, when viewed at an angle, becomes something closer to violet. You trace a tiny nick along the edge. A note nearby reads, "Wings imperfect, flew further anyway." The paper beneath your hands is warm from sunlight. The ink is still drying in the hallway. Someone walks softly past, pausing just long enough to glance in and smile before continuing on. You're not disturbing anything. You're part of the process, and that's how the language of wings formed, not with lectures or diagrams, but with quiet gazes and careful hands. This wasn't science as conquest. This was science as courtesy. Many drawings were kept in folios alongside pressed flowers from the same gardens where the butterflies had landed. Some were shared, discreetly, through letters. Others were lost to time, forgotten in drawers, found decades later, and mistaken for poems with illustrations, which in a way they were. You close the folio gently. The afternoon light presses against the window. In the garden beyond, a butterfly lands, wings open, wings closed, wings open again. And though you don't name it, you see it clearly. Not everything needs a label to be understood. You step into a narrower hallway now, one that hums faintly with old wood and paper. The air smells like dried lavender and ink, and on the wall beside you hangs a framed piece of writing, not a poem, not a proclamation, just a list, names, dates, wing colors, and one phrase repeated over and over, sent by post. Because, yes, people mailed butterflies, not live ones. Not always. Often they were preserved, sometimes dried, sometimes pinned, but often in a state of deliberate stillness, packaged carefully between cotton and card, and shipped quietly, politely, across France and sometimes across borders. The mail became a slow network of fluttering exchange. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the mid to late 18th century, the practice of mailing butterfly specimens had become common among amateur naturalists and collectors across Europe. These exchanges weren't commercial, they were social, courteous, a polite swap between enthusiasts. If you lived in the countryside and caught something rare, you might send it to a friend in Paris. If you'd perfected a drying method, you might offer your technique in a note, accompanied by a demonstration. The process was delicate. First, the specimen had to be euthanized, often by brief exposure to alcohol vapors, then dried. Wings were gently flattened with parchment, held between cotton batting, and slipped into slim wooden boxes or stiff envelopes. Instructions sometimes accompanied the butterfly. Please open slowly and in good light. Wings likely to flutter when touched. Do not mistake for revival. And then came the fringe details. Some senders went further. They included small pressed flowers, snippets of poetry, or dried herbs in the envelope, not as decoration, but as context. This is what the butterfly liked. This is what it fed on. In one known example, a specimen arrived in Rouen alongside a folded note reading simply, "She emerged at dusk, beside my mother's roses." These weren't deliveries, they were introductions. You imagine now the journey of one such butterfly, a pale comma, collected near Avignon, packed in a slim walnut box lined with handkerchief linen, and shipped by post carriage to a cousin near Nantes. The box arrives in the early morning. It is opened by candlelight. The butterfly is not alive, but it is whole. The recipient studies it, not for scientific insight, but for the sense of having touched a moment that once had wings. This brings us to the scholarly uncertainty. Was this postal butterfly exchange part of Enlightenment taxonomy? Or was it a ritual of aesthetic connection? There's no clear answer. Many of the preserved letters from this time include both data and sentiment. One might read mottled edge, 6-point underside, sluggish before dusk. Reminds me of that slow summer when we read Rousseau aloud. You sit now in a chair by a writing desk. On it are boxes, some labeled, some blank. A stack of correspondence tied with green ribbon. You untie one bundle. The writing is careful, slightly flourished. The ink has faded to brown. The letter reads, Dear M. I found her near the time, resting on a stone warmed by morning. I've sent her to you with a petal from the same bloom. May she arrive in one piece. If not, the drawing is enclosed. Inside the envelope, a folded watercolor, just the outline of a butterfly, hastily but lovingly captured. Not all mailed butterflies arrived intact. It was part of the exchange. Specimens were often received with an air of gentle fatalism. One journal notes, arrived crumpled, beauty intact in memory, replied with sympathy and a sketch. Journey-wise, you trace a different path this time, the movement of an idea across distance, not by horse or foot, but by envelope, by note, by the soft bump of carriage wheels over a road lined with poplars. One collector wrote, I know this person by their handwriting and their butterflies. I need no other proof they exist. And that's the heart of this section, not the scientific value of the specimens, but the human ritual behind their travel. To send a butterfly was to say, I saw something, I noticed, and I thought you should know. You lift the lid on one more box. Inside a butterfly with slightly frayed wings, a sprig of thyme, and a note that says, she liked basil too, but landed more often near the lemon verbena. It isn't thrilling, it isn't grand, but it is full of attention, and somewhere in that slow, careful process of wrapping and mailing and waiting, a kind of quiet art was born, not the art of flight, but the art of sharing stillness. You return now to one of the quieter rooms in the chateau, not a study, not quite a parlor, to just a softly lit chamber with pale green wallpaper, where dust floats in the light like barely there lace. On one wall is a narrow cabinet with doors that swing outward on silent hinges. Inside boxes, dozens of them, some square, some long, some inlaid with brass. Each has been carefully stacked, carefully labeled. They contain butterflies, not live, not fluttering, but preserved, and not in the way you'd expect. This isn't scientific storage. It's decorative, meticulous, nearly devotional. This is where butterfly boxes became their own art form. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the mid-18th century, French butterfly enthusiasts began constructing specialized storage cases to house their specimens. These cases weren't just utilitarian, they were beautiful, covered in silk, trimmed with gold leaf, or embossed with scrollwork. They functioned as displays of taste as much as organization. Some were designed to sit on desks or shelves. Others fit neatly into drawers, each layer like the page of a quiet book. Each butterfly inside was pinned, not haphazardly, but symmetrically, centered, balanced, wings opened precisely, labeled in careful script. Some had tiny notations like caught at dusk or one broken antenna, but otherwise serene, fringe detail in some aristocratic households. Butterfly boxes were lined with paper lace, delicate, scalloped cuttings that framed the specimens like portraits. One collection from Provence even displayed pairs of butterflies arranged to mirror each other, wing for wing, like ballroom dancers mid-bow. The effect was not scientific, it was theatrical, gentle drama in soft color. You sit beside one of these boxes now. The lid is hinged, covered in green silk, faded at the corners. Inside 12 butterflies, all variations of orange and cream. They rest on pale velvet, each with a name card in slanted cursive. You can barely read the titles. Some are species, others nicknames. One is labeled Comtessa June Breeze, and there's your scholarly uncertainty for this section. Were these boxes meant to preserve knowledge or preserve beauty? Naturalists at the time were split. Some decried the practice as frivolous ornament, claiming that aesthetics were distorting taxonomy. Others defended it fiercely, arguing that art and science were not opposites, that the very act of arranging these fragile bodies was an exercise in classification, harmony, and respect. A letter from 1762 describes one woman's collection as a chapel of wings. She did not keep them to study. She kept them to remember. Each specimen was associated with a season, a walk, a conversation, a sky that had since changed. Her butterflies were not data. They were dates. The journey here is still, but rich in texture. You run your fingers lightly across the edge of a box. You open another. This one lined with deep red velvet. The butterflies arranged by shade, from pale yellow to near black. No labels, just a gradient, a spectrum shaped by hand and memory. There's a drawing on the nearby table, a sketch of a butterfly box, with notations on spacing, border width, wing angle. The attention to form is almost architectural, as though the maker believed that a butterfly's resting pose, once preserved, should echo the way it once moved through air. You find a box that is nearly empty, just 3 butterflies inside, each with cracked wings, but they're given the same careful treatment as the others. No labels this time, just a note tucked under the cotton kept not for perfection, but for presence. These were the quietest of the garden, even today. Museums that house these collections struggle with interpretation. Are they scientific relics, private altars, amateur art installations? They resist categorization, just as the butterflies once resisted being caught. The deeper message in all this, perhaps, is not what the butterflies were, but how they were seen, not as trophies, not as tools, but as something worth arranging gently, with clean hands and slow breath. The sun outside dips lower. In the cabinet, the velvet begins to glow faintly gold. You close the final box. The hinge clicks quietly into place. The butterflies remain still, but the impression they leave on linen, on lace, on memory is not still at all. The light in the house has shifted again, faded now into the long stillness of pre-dusk, when everything holds its breath before the evening begins. You're in a sunroom now, pale and quiet, with gauzy curtains fluttering just enough to remind you that time is still passing. Here, 2 women sit across from each other at a small round table. They aren't speaking. One is carefully snipping sprigs of rue. The other is writing slowly in a notebook, pausing now and then to glance toward the window. Outside, butterflies circle a patch of violets with the air of unhurried decision. None of them are in cages. None of them are pinned. They're just visiting. And this is where our story lands next, at the quiet center of butterfly farming in 18th century France, the women. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Although the scientific establishments of the Enlightenment were overwhelmingly male, the domestic side of natural study, including butterfly rearing and observation, was often quietly managed by women. They weren't publishing treatises or debating taxonomy in salons, but they were cultivating, documenting, and preserving with an attention to detail that rivaled any formal academic. Women managed the gardens. They fed the caterpillars. They organized the boxes and pressed the flowers that accompanied mailed specimens. And while their names were often left off of records, their hands were on nearly every part of the process. You pause beside one of these women now, her dress a soft gray, her hands lightly stained green from herb sap. She gestures to a tray by the window, where 3 chrysalises hang from twigs. That one will open tomorrow, she says, not confidently, but kindly, or not. This brings us to the fringe details some women, denied access to official scientific societies, formed their own informal observation networks through letters, gatherings, and exchanged notes. They shared butterfly observations using code names, initials, or no names at all. One Parisian group referred to themselves, half jokingly, as les papillonneuses. Their symbol was a blue moth embroidered into the corner of handkerchiefs. Their observations weren't theoretical, they were practical. Laid eggs on rue after 4th day in sunlight, favored purple blooms, avoided marigold, would not feed on bruised leaves, details that mattered, especially to other women trying to replicate the conditions in faraway gardens. Scholarly uncertainty arises here. Of course, how much influence did these women really have? Were they simply keepers of gardens? Or were they shaping the field in ways the record didn't preserve? We may never know. But their presence is undeniable in marginal notes, in elegant handwriting beside wing illustrations, and in entire collections meticulously maintained without any public claim to authorship. Your journey-style detail now takes you to a windowsill. You sit gently next to a lace-covered table with a book open to a page of hand-colored butterflies. A teacup rests beside it, untouched, gone cold. Someone has drawn faint lines around a butterfly's wing, testing a pattern, tracing a dream. It's hard to say. Across the room, another woman adjusts a glass dome over a tray of parsley. Inside, 4 caterpillars inch silently. She watches, not with excitement, but with a kind of settled attention, as if this were no different from embroidery or shelling peas. Precision wrapped in patience. The division of labor wasn't formalized, but it was understood. The husband might record the species, the wife raised the insect, the son labeled the specimen, the daughter fed it, observed it, learned to tell the difference between moving and ready. There's a calm resistance in this arrangement, gentle, domestic, but quietly revolutionary, in a world where intellectual domains were gated and hierarchical. Butterfly farming let women claim a space of their own, not by force, by practice. A scholar writing 2 centuries later described this as the invisible science of the drawing room. But at the time, it wasn't science or art, it was habit, a kind of soft repetition that yielded knowledge whether or not anyone noticed. You pick up a journal now, resting on a cushion by the window, inside page after page of inked butterflies, not labeled, not numbered, just drawn, sometimes traced twice, 3 times, until the shape felt right. Each drawing slightly different, some with more color, some with notes like wings too thick here. Remember to lighten next time. And that's the point. These weren't made to impress, they were made to understand. You hear the tea kettle in the next room. One of the women rises to tend it. The other doesn't move. She's watching a butterfly that has landed on the edge of her apron. She doesn't flinch. She simply waits. Not everything in this world needs to be chased. Some things come closer if you're very, very still. The sky outside has begun to take on that early evening glow, the one that isn't quite sunset, but makes everything look like it's been dusted with chamomile. You're standing in a different room now, but the atmosphere hasn't changed. Still slow, still soft, just a little more conversational. The salon is filled, though not loudly. This isn't a ball or a banquet, just an evening gathering, the kind that includes soft clinks of porcelain, polite laughter, and the occasional thoughtful pause long enough for a butterfly to land unnoticed on someone's sleeve. This is where butterflies found their way into polite society, not as scientific curiosities, not as garden distractions, but as conversation pieces, ideas, symbols. The 18th century French salons were known for their mix of intellect and elegance, and before long, the subject of metamorphosis had made its way onto the parlor rug beside discussions of Rousseau and Voltaire. Here's your mainstream historical fact during the Enlightenment. The concept of transformation, of development from one state to another, was a frequent subject of intellectual discussion, while much of the focus was on human reasoning and political structures. Butterflies provided a tidy, natural metaphor, something everyone could see, handle, and admire, while also quietly contemplating the mysteries of life cycles, growth, and change. You cross the room now, gliding slowly between upholstered chairs. A man in pale waistcoat is describing, with genuine enthusiasm, the precise moment he watched a chrysalis split open. A woman nods, adding that her daughter once fainted at the sight. A younger guest nearby raises a skeptical eyebrow and inquires if butterflies dream during pupation. No one answers definitively, but several seem pleased that the question was asked. Here's your fringe detail for the evening in certain circles. It became fashionable to pair butterfly anecdotes with philosophical quotes. One recorded exchange includes a woman describing a moth's dusty wing pattern immediately after quoting Montaigne. Another gathering featured a competition for the best winged metaphor. The winner compared the blue of a swallowtail to liberty seen through stained glass. Second place went to someone who said butterflies reminded him of poorly made arguments, lovely, fragile, and difficult to pin down. This brings us to the scholarly uncertainty: were these discussions serious? Or social performance? Did butterflies actually shape thought? Or were they just elegant evidence points both ways? Some Enlightenment writers, like Buffon, referenced insects in earnest. Others saw them as adornment, polite distractions. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. The salons were places where ideas flitted and landed like butterflies themselves, here for a moment, then gone, but remembered nonetheless. You sit beside a card table now. On it, a folded vellum notebook, ink pot, and a fan painted with a butterfly motif. The hostess holds court nearby, not loudly, but with a voice like polished glass. She speaks not of politics, but of gardens. She describes a black-veined white that emerged just this morning, and the way its wings looked almost translucent against the window. Someone else mentions how Rousseau, in his Confessions, speaks of insects with such specificity it feels like a shared memory. Someone else counters that Diderot found butterflies silly, unworthy of deep thought, and a third offers a quote no one can quite source. What is a butterfly but the promise of stillness. Delayed, this isn't science. It's something adjacent, philosophical musing through the lens of wings. The journey detail here isn't physical, it's conversational. You move not between rooms, but between sentences. Each topic alights, rests, and drifts off again. Politics, poetry, pupation. The rhythms are gentle, the shifts smooth. A man near the window quietly opens a butterfly box. He doesn't announce it. He just shows it to the person beside him, who nods as though greeting an old friend. The wings inside are still, beautiful, unlabeled. This, perhaps, is where butterflies had their greatest influence in the drawing rooms, where certainty was less important than suggestion, where no one was trying to catalog anything, but everyone was happy to wonder. There's a single candle burning low in the corner. The scent of wax and rosewater fills the room. A butterfly, real, uninvited, and wholly unbothered, drifts in through the window and circles twice before settling on the edge of a silver tray. No one flinches, no one moves to catch it. One guest says softly, "Well, that's settled." Then, no one asks what he means. Everyone just nods. You're farther along now, not in the grand salons or tucked garden corners, but somewhere quieter, older. The light has gone from soft gold to a cool, even blue, the kind of light that doesn't shine so much as settle. You walk through a long, narrow hallway, and at the end, a heavy wooden door stands open, revealing a room lined with shelves and oddities, the cabinet of curiosities. This was the final resting place of many butterflies, though not in the sense of endings. In the 18th century, to be included in a cabinet of curiosities was to be made part of a narrative of wonder, of classification, of human desire to hold on to fleeting things. Here's your mainstream historical fact: cabinets of curiosities, or Wunderkammern, as they were originally called, were collections of objects that defied easy categorization. Popular throughout Europe from the Renaissance onward, and still fashionable in Enlightenment-era France. These cabinets held fossils, coral, rare books, dried insects, bones, odd coins, and preserved animals, and by the 1700s, butterflies had earned a steady presence among them, delicate messengers from the natural world, frozen at the peak of their beauty. You approach one such cabinet now. Its drawers are deep and made of dark wood, their brass handles worn smooth. You slide one open gently. Inside, a velvet-lined tray of butterflies, each pinned in place, but arranged like a constellation. No names, just numbers, small, handwritten, faintly faded. A list nearby references each W11, found near the bellflowers. Dillison 12, paler than its mate. Fiddler 13, arrived by letter, unknown sender. This is not scientific taxonomy. This is curation, and the fringe detail you notice next supports that several butterflies are flanked not by their scientific notes, but by objects: a tiny spoon, a pressed violet, a glass bead, each one laid beside a specimen, not explained, just paired, like a sentence in a language you don't quite know, but can still read the rhythm of. Cabinets of this kind didn't always belong to scientists. They were often owned by aristocrats, amateur collectors, or the mildly eccentric, people who saw the world not as a system to decode, but a tapestry to arrange. To them, a butterfly wasn't just an insect. It was a punctuation mark, a visual pause in the clutter of seashells and snuff boxes. And that brings us to the scholarly uncertainty for this section. Were these collections driven by a desire to understand nature or to possess it? Some historians argue that the butterfly's place in the cabinet was symbolic of ephemerality, transformation, lightness. Others contend it was purely visual, a decorative addition, meant to break up the monotony of skulls and minerals. Either interpretation fits. The butterflies didn't care. They stayed quiet. Either way, you find one drawer entirely devoted to wings, not whole butterflies, just the wings, paired, labeled, pressed beneath thin glass. The note accompanying them reads collected from damaged specimens, too beautiful to discard, preserved for color study. It's not grief, but it is reverence. Your journey style moment here is all indoors. No footsteps, just drawers opened with care and drawers closed with thought. You run your fingers lightly along the edge of a shelf lined with curios, a dried seahorse, a tooth carved with initials, a feather that doesn't belong to any local bird, and next to it, a butterfly pinned beneath a glass dome. The label wore gold like it meant something. The room itself smells like cedar and dust. Not forgotten dust, chosen dust, the kind that says, "We've left this undisturbed on purpose." There's a chairs in the corner, plain, with a cushion faded from sun and use. Someone sat here, often. Someone looked at these butterflies and thought about things not recorded. You sit now, too. A butterfly is not a mystery that begs to be solved. It is a pattern that offers to be noticed. Even now, museums inherit these old cabinets. Archivists open drawers and find butterflies stored in tissue paper, sometimes folded into pages of old newspapers or tucked beside botanical notes. Most are fragile, some are crumbling, but many remain intact, wings faded but still patterned, like memories that didn't forget how to shimmer. You don't need to know their names. You just need to open the drawer, look, and be still for a moment. That was always enough. The room beyond the cabinet feels a little more lived in, a little more worn. Books stacked sideways, curtains sun-bleached, a hearth that looks recently swept but not recently lit. You walk through it quietly. This is a house where noise isn't forbidden, just unnecessary. On the table by the window, a quill lies at rest atop a closed leather-bound notebook. Next to it, a small tin of dried ink, and just beyond that, a shallow bowl containing what appears to be butterfly wings, scattered, delicate, weightless as breath. You realize, with a sort of softness, that these are not discarded, they're studied. This is where drawing took over when catching no longer felt necessary, because eventually, many butterfly keepers and those who simply loved their presence put down the net and picked up the brush. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In 18th century France, illustration was considered an essential component of natural history, whether for personal use, informal records, or professional publication. Detailed renderings of plants, insects, and animals were expected of any serious collector. Butterflies, with their symmetrical wings and complex patterns, became frequent subjects, not only for scientists, but for artists and hobbyists alike. You glance over a series of open pages laid out across a workbench. They form a sequence, a butterfly mid-flight, wings captured at different angles, not frozen, but gently posed. The strokes are controlled but fluid. The artist wasn't trying to conquer nature with accuracy. They were trying to meet it on paper. Here's your fringe detail, one artist. A clergyman's daughter from Aix insisted on painting each butterfly only once it had died of natural causes. She waited, sometimes weeks, refusing to draw from memory or pin live specimens. She called her drawings portraits of stillness in the corner of each. She noted where the butterfly had landed last before its death. Her illustrations, never published, were found decades later sewn into the lining of a writing desk. There's a scholarly uncertainty tied to these works. Too, were they intended to teach, to document, or were they a form of private devotion? Many drawings survive without captions, without notes, just the image, clean and complete, floating in the center of the page like a silent tribute. You sit now beside an easel near the corner window. The afternoon light falls across it in a long stretch. A partially finished illustration rests on the board, a red admiral, rendered in ink wash and the faintest touches of blue. The palette sits untouched. A second wing waits to be mirrored. Someone has written beneath it. In very small script, he was late to emerge. The others had flown. Your journey here is not through space, but through observation. You lean in, you study the lines. You notice how the pigment shifts, dark where the brush paused, pale where it rushed. The artist knew this butterfly, not by species, by gesture. Another set of drawings rests nearby. These are less precise, looser. The wings are not symmetrical. The colors blur. One is just a silhouette. They're not mistakes. They're impressions, each titled with a date, a time of day, and a single word, tired, windy, still. And that's the quiet truth of this section. Not every butterfly had to be perfect. Not every wing had to be captured in full. The value was in trying, in sitting still long enough to witness what would otherwise go unnoticed. A letter tucked into one of the notebooks includes this line I've drawn her each morning this week. But I do not believe she knows I am here. Butterfly illustration was not just about replication. It was about presence, a form of meditation that left behind color and paper, and not much else, but somehow it felt like enough. You turn the final page of one album. On the last sheet is a butterfly drawn in pencil only, barely filled in, no color, no label, just a note in the margin too bright to follow with ink. Sometimes the effort was the record, and the rest was left to memory. You've moved again, but not far. Just down a gently curving hallway into a space with tiled floors, open shutters, and a breeze that smells like dry time and page edges. This room feels lighter, even playful. There's a small writing table pushed up against the window, and beside it a stack of neat, ribbon-tied envelopes, dozens of them, all handwritten, all addressed in the same looping hand. This was the part of butterfly farming that didn't involve fields, or drawings, or even butterflies. It involved letters, because long before scientific journals and academic societies formalized natural study, there was something slower, softer polite correspondence, and in 18th century France. Butterfly enthusiasts wrote to each other with remarkable care. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Epistolary exchange was a central method of information sharing during the Enlightenment. Naturalists, both amateur and professional, traded notes, sketches, seeds, and specimens through the mail. The Royal Society did it. The Jardin du Roi did it. But so did butterfly collectors, quiet ones, tucked in vineyards and village houses, who composed letters not for publication, but for presents. You untie one of the bundles now. The top letter is dated 1764 and opens with Dearest Elizabeth. I enclose 3 wings from the orange tree bloomers, as well as a line drawing I attempted. She landed on my wrist and stayed, I think, out of courtesy. It isn't a paper about taxonomy. It's a moment, preserved in ink. The fringe detail many of these letters included not just butterflies or their images, but stories, anecdotes, descriptions of what the air felt like that day, what the butterfly chose to land on, who else was in the room. It was common to include dried herbs, a clipped petal, or a scrap of the paper the specimen had first rested on. And while most of these letters are lost to time, a handful survive in museum archives and private collections. One letter includes an apology for sending only a sketch, as the real one escaped just as I reached for the blotting paper. You sit now in the wooden chair, unfolding one envelope after another. Some pages are delicately scented, some are smudged, some are written in an old, uncertain French, more feeling than grammar. One letter, written from a small village near Avignon, reads, I do not know what kind this was, only that she hovered near the rosemary and returned 3 times before vanishing. Perhaps you'll know her by my poor sketch, or perhaps she was just visiting. Scholars still debate the value of these correspondences. Were they proto-scientific records, personal journals with stamps? One school of thought argues they were as much about community as information. You didn't write about a butterfly to claim it. You wrote to say, I saw something beautiful and thought of you. The uncertainty lies in the margins. Many letters include fragments of observation, but never full species names. Others mention butterflies indirectly. Like muses, the garden was full today. One visitor brighter than the rest. I've pressed a leaf from the spot where she paused. Your journey detail here unfolds through paper. You imagine the courier, tired, dusty, handing a note to a housekeeper, who places it beside a teacup without comment. You imagine the recipient setting down her embroidery, smiling before reading a single word, simply because she knows the handwriting. You open another envelope. Inside is a single folded wing, fragile, not pinned, not labeled, just resting between 2 pages like a memory. There's a poem beside it, only half complete. She danced above the basil, not looking back. I watched, as if I'd met her once in dream. There's a profound softness to it all. These people didn't share data. They shared moments. Wings became metaphors. Sketches became letters. The mail became a way to say. I noticed something small, and it made me think of how we are all changing. And here's the quiet brilliance of it. This wasn't just hobby. This was a gentle, national network of observation and attention, built not on publication, but correspondence, handwritten, hand-folded, hand-sealed. Butterfly farming, it turns out, wasn't confined to gardens or greenhouses. It lived in letters. And now you lean back, surrounded by opened envelopes and quiet paper. You don't need to respond. The point was never the reply. It was the sharing, the momentary recognition that someone else, far away, looked up one afternoon and found something fragile and thought, yes, I should tell someone about this. It's darker now. The shutters are closed, and the corners of the room stretch quietly into shadow. You're walking through the back of the house, through a narrow corridor that ends in a doorway opening onto a private chapel. Not a grand one, just stone, candlelight, and stillness. The air smells faintly of beeswax and lavender oil, and just above the altar a painting, not of saints, not of suffering, a butterfly. The wings are wide, gold and pale blue, hovering above a stylized flower. It isn't religious iconography in the traditional sense, but it isn't not either. It sits at that intersection of natural beauty and spiritual metaphor that 18th century France loved so much. Because here's the thing, butterflies didn't just end up in gardens, letters, and drawers. They ended up in philosophy, in poetry, in theology. Here's your mainstream historical fact, the metaphor of the butterfly as a symbol of transformation, rebirth. And the soul has deep roots in European thought. In Christian symbolism, the butterfly often represented the resurrection, the emergence from the chrysalis as an echo of rising from the grave. In Enlightenment France, this metaphor gained subtle traction, slipping into sermons, journal entries, and private devotionals, but rarely with grandeur, more often with gentleness. The fringe detail in one preserved devotional text from a convent near Lyon. A nun describes a caterpillar she kept in her cell as a teacher more honest than many sermons. She writes, "It ate quietly, disappeared into stillness, and returned as something else entirely. I did not cheer. I sat. Her notes were never published. They were tucked into the flyleaf of her prayer book, but they reflect something important for many. Butterfly farming wasn't just natural observation, it was meditation, a way to contemplate change, passage, and the unprovable promise of renewal. You sit now in a pew beside the altar. Candles flicker, somewhere, faintly. A moth taps against a high stained glass window. The air hums with the kind of silence that's made of wood and waiting. This brings us to the scholarly uncertainty. How widespread were these spiritual interpretations? Some argue they were peripheral, private associations with no formal place in religious doctrine. Others believe they were quietly encouraged, especially in spaces where nature and faith were allowed to overlap. What's known is this butterflies appear in religious art of the period, not as central figures, but as additions. In the corner of a canvas, hovering beside a hand painted into the border of a psalter, often unremarked but unmistakable. You run your hand along the back of the pew. Someone has carved a shape there, small, crude, and unmistakably winged. No date, no initials, just an act of attention made permanent in oak. Butterfly metaphors also appeared in poetry. A handwritten chapbook in the next room includes a series of short verses, all anonymous. One ends with the line, "If my breath must end, let it end like hers, folded, golden, and not looking back." Not all the verses are hopeful. One laments the shortness of the butterfly's life. Another wonders if it ever remembers being a caterpillar. But all of them share one thing: respect for the in-between. That was the key. Butterflies weren't admired only for their colors or elegance. They were admired for their change, their visible transition from one thing to another, in an era obsessed with structure and order. The butterfly offered a quiet rebellion, a life that included stillness, a season that demanded waiting. Your journey style moment here is almost entirely internal. You aren't walking anymore, you're sitting, watching the flicker of candlelight move across the butterfly painting, listening to the moth at the window, thinking about transformation not as an event, but as a long, slow unfolding, one that happens in quiet places when no one is watching. Outside the chapel, the night has deepened. Inside, the butterflies, painted, carved, imagined, rest in their various forms, wings open, wings closed, wings in process. There's a final note scratched in Latin at the bottom of the altar cloth, Fiat transitus lenis. Let the passage be gentle, and whether they meant the soul, the evening, or a single butterfly at the end of its day, it fits. The hour is late now. The house has grown still in a way that doesn't invite questions. You step softly, not because anyone is sleeping, but because it feels right to. You're outside again, walking the edge of the orchard where butterflies used to drift in the warm hours. The garden's shut down for the night, not formally, just by agreement. The flowers have closed, the herbs are still, and the sugar dishes have been taken inside. But not everything is asleep. You pause at the edge of the path where the last of the lavender glows silver in the moonlight. There's a faint flutter, a shape, not a butterfly. Those are resting, tucked in leaves and curled under petals, but a moth, pale and soft-winged, moving with the kind of grace that makes you forget about its difference. This is the part of the story that many collectors didn't document. What happened when the daylight visitors left, and dusk brought out the other winged ones, the ones less studied, less praised, but no less extraordinary. And this brings us to the overlooked truth butterfly farming in 18th century France, for all its beauty and charm, eventually hit its limits, not because people lost interest, but because they became too interested. Competition began to grow. Supplies of rarer butterflies grew harder to find. Some collectors began traveling farther afield. Others began purchasing specimens from distant colonies. The hobby, once intimate and local, became louder, exported, monetized, exaggerated. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the late 1700s, butterfly collecting began to shift from a contemplative pastime to a more competitive enterprise. Exotic species from Africa, Asia, and the Americas were traded and sold. French collectors, hungry for variety, began importing pinned specimens by the dozens. The meditative quality began to wane. In its place came trophies. Scholars have written about this shift. Some see it as inevitable, a mirror of the broader Enlightenment impulse to catalog and claim. Others see it as the quiet unraveling of something more fragile, an art form that couldn't survive the spotlight. And then there are the fringe notes, the ones not in the journals or museum catalogs, but in letters, usually unsigned, or in the margins of estate inventories. The butterflies have grown scarce in the western orchard. No eggs last season, perhaps too much activity. We've begun sketching moths now. They ask less. Your journey tonight is simple. You walk the edge of what remains. You pass a corner of the herb garden that once brimmed with painted ladies. Only rosemary grows there now, thick and ungroomed. A cane trellis, once used for sweet peas to attract swallowtails, has begun to lean. The butterflies aren't gone, just quieter, fewer. One journal entry from 1791 reads, "I sent for the dark blue from India. She arrived crushed. My wife asked if I would mind drawing from memory instead. It wasn't loss." Exactly. It was exhaustion, the slow realization that something so light and changeable could not support too much weight. Butterflies were not meant to be business. The scholarly uncertainty here is a tender one. Did the decline of local butterfly farming reflect ecological change or emotional fatigue? So, there are no formal records of species collapse, but there are many records of people stopping, not with bitterness, with resignation, as though the joy had stretched too thin. Back in the garden, the moth drifts again, settling on the stone wall. Its wings are not bright, but they hold a quiet shimmer. You crouch. You don't name it. You don't sketch it. You just watch. And maybe that's what this moment is for. Not to mourn what butterfly farming became, but to return to what it was: quiet observation, a mutual pause between two beings, a moment unclaimed. You turn toward the house. In the window, someone has left a lantern burning low, not for light, but for gentleness, and on the sill beside it, one last note. They came less often this year, but when they did, I remembered how to breathe slower. Not every practice needs to be preserved. Some are meant to be recalled, in fragments, in scents, in the hush between footsteps. And butterflies, it seems, were never asking to be collected, just noticed. It's fully night now. The garden is dark, the shutters latched, the last candle extinguished. Even the moths have disappeared into the folds of ivy and stone. You're walking one last path, narrow, familiar, gravel soft beneath your shoes. There's no destination anymore, just the walk. The house is quiet behind you. The tools have been put away, notebooks closed, wings tucked into boxes. The butterfly room has gone still, not silent with finality, but with rest, like something that knows its work is done, for now. And as you step into the far end of the garden, the part where the hedges thin and the trees breathe a little more openly, you see them, the night flowers, moonflower, evening primrose, nicotiana. They bloom not for bees, not for butterflies, but for other guests. Quieter guests, ones who don't announce their arrival, and who leave no trace when they go. You stop here, no longer a visitor, just a presence. The gravel ends, the sky stretches, the breeze softens, and so the wind down begins. There's nothing left to gather tonight. The boxes have been closed, the sketches left to dry. The wings that once fluttered are still now, not trapped, not lost, but remembered. Butterfly farming in 18th century France wasn't a revolution. It didn't reshape empires or alter the march of thought, but it offered something else, something slower, a moment held between changes, a moment like this. You sit down now on a bench beneath a fig tree that has stood here longer than any of the notebooks on the shelf. The air is warm, but still. Even the insects have gone quiet. There's no need to speak. There's no one left to explain things to. Just breathe. Let your shoulders fall. Let the tension in your hands soften. There's no chrysalis to open tonight, no garden to tend, no wings to label. There's only the sound of your breath and the feel of stillness settling around you. You don't need to recall every detail. You don't need to remember the Latin names or the pinned specimens or who wrote which letter. You only need to remember that once, Someone looked closely. That once. Someone waited quietly by a sprig of rue for a caterpillar to climb high enough to disappear. That once. Someone let a butterfly go and didn't follow, and that's enough. The night has folded itself around you now, like wings closing gently for sleep. Let yourself close too. Loosen your thoughts. Let them drift like the soft, uneven flight of something light enough to float and quiet enough to be missed. You're not being asked to do anything, just to rest, just to settle, just to sleep.